It's a highly controversial subject, but I think that those of philosophic mind should attempt at least to comprehend some of the dimensions of the relationships between partisan politics and partisan religious organizations. We are on the horns of a dilemma at this particular point because the power of religion was originally vested in a class or caste of highly skilled, highly informed persons. The hierophants of the ancient mysteries in Greece and Rome and Egypt were very well-informed men. They had given their lives to learning, and the temple was also the university. It was the temple that was the cradle of sciences. Priests of the mysteries were astronomers. They were geographers, anatomists, physiologists. They combined their sacred learning with the most profound knowledge available in their time for the general improvement of mankind. Those seeking office, either religious or secular, were initiated into these organizations. And the first and most important requirement was self-discipline. The individual was required to attain a degree of integrity that lifted him above the level of corruption. He was informed on many subjects. There was no division between sacred and secular learning. And those who entered into the temple rites might in later life be emperors, generals, leaders in knowledge and science, or they might be private citizens with unusual abilities. In every case, the information provided gave them a full and solid foundation upon which to develop a philosophy of life. This condition gradually came into conflict with the secular ambitions of persons, most of them either uninitiated or else corrupted even after they had accepted the obligations of the temple. It is therefore very important to realize that when we think in terms of religion, that we understand exactly what it means in its full and most complete sense. Religion was primarily the continuing effort to discover truth. It was concerned not with the attitudes of persons, but with universal principles. The search was for the laws of life, as these revealed the laws of God. Now it is obvious that with such a background, and with such dedication, purifications, and methods of instruction, religion provided the most dynamic force in the development of civilization. It became not only a leader, but a common denominator of the various levels of human activity. The religions of that time were subsidized by the state. They were part of a traditional inheritance that had descended from an unknown past. The traditions, the cultures, the allegiances, all grouped around these sacred institutions. Of such minds we have Pythagoras, who probably did more to advanced sciences of music and mathematics than any other recorded. Atomism by Democritus. We also found among them powerful minds dedicated to the preservation of all available knowledge. these initiated priests were fully aware of the grand scheme of things. They were serving principles primarily, as these principles revealed the will of God. Now, under these conditions, the mysteries flourished for centuries. And to a measure, they have influenced practically every modern world religion. They have contributed to the basic concept of religion, and that is obedience to divine will. This obedience was not primarily sectarian in those days, and the chain of mystery institutions, which spread not only throughout the Mediterranean area and North Africa, but went all the way to India and China. These institutions were compatible. There was no question of whether or not an institution worshipped the true God or a false God. For in this system, all principles preserved conduct, and all wise people recognized and rejoiced in the wisdom of other people. Many of the initiates of Greece were also initiates of Egypt, and some of them went into the Far East. Buddhists and Hindus came to study in Greece, Antioch, and Ephesus. They were a kinship of enlightenment, and because they had a common realization of the principles underlying worship, they were compatible. There was no competition of creeds. There was no division by land or race, by language, or by symbolism, which prevented the one who was initiated into one order from being received as an equal by those of other similar organizations. It therefore is rather obvious that in its ideal state, religion represents a unity of beliefs. It represents a unity based upon integrities. It was an exact science which manifested itself through the development of virtue and morality throughout the world. Now, under such conditions as these, it was quite obvious that kings and princes and rulers were initiated. Also that they had counselors who were informed in any knowledge which they could not achieve. The Emperor Julian admitted that he was a novice in these matters. He did not understand the full meaning of the great descent of wisdom, but he had been initiated. He recognized the integrities, and he leaned heavily upon the counsels of those better informed than himself. All this situation places religion in an idealistic situation, a situation the importance of which cannot be in any way questioned. But gradually changes took place, and we began to develop a certain separation between church and state. It was no longer the function of leaders to bring their problems to the temple. And when in the old days they did so, the judgment they received was suitable to the solution of the secular problems of society. But as time went on, this happy brotherhood faded away, and gradually religion became an isolated area of human thought. It became one institution among institutions. It no longer held the common veneration of all classes of people. As this condition continued, it was obvious that secular considerations began to dominate. As these secular considerations became more numerous, conflicts were inevitable. These secular problems, separated from a high philosophy and an inclusive religion, became virtually unsolvable. The various kingdoms began to depend upon secular statesmanship. They began to select persons who more or less would advance the personal ambitions of leaders. The counselor began to counsel the king how to enlarge his own domain. He became more or less an aid or an assistant to a secular government. In old times, some of these statesmen were obviously persons of high reputation. They did a very sincere job, but as a result of the continuing break between religion and secular affairs, they lost the control of the minds of the rulers. The rulers began to think their own thoughts. They began to plan their own programs, and it gradually dawned upon them that power, which was being more and more vested in individuals, that this power could be used advantageously to advance the concerns of princes. This type of separation has led gradually to a condition which is being brought strongly into focus by present world affairs. We have a very strong and depressing example in the present situation in Iran. Here we have a country that is coming more and more under a theological political structure. As a result of this, we find what we might term fundamentalism, the fundamentalism of the Muslim world, taking precedence over the well-being of the people and the advancement and progress of the country. We know beyond question that such a program cannot endure indefinitely. A small island of orthodoxy cannot continue to exist in a world which is no longer under the domination of such orthodox concepts. Now, there are many points in the Muslim religion which are highly desirable. In substance and essence, it is founded upon a combination of Judaism and Christianity. Muhammad would turn in his grave at the present situation, and yet gradually the rising power of the caliphate has resulted in the submergence of the concepts of Muhammad and the development of the high personal ambitions of political leadership. We therefore now find that the general condition of society is being damaged by what might be termed theological orthodoxy. Orthodoxy which is not based upon either the Bible nor the Koran, but is really opportunism, the ability of political leadership veiling itself under religious cloak, attempting to regain its authority in the development, scientific, industrial, economic, and cultural of a modern people. Now, the situation is an exaggerated one, and we believed and hoped that long ago this type of attitude had vanished from the earth, but it has not, and it continues to be a very serious matter. Now, what is essentially wrong with the interpretation that modern Iran has given to the teachings of Muhammad? It has allowed them to fall into the hands of individuals who were not actually religiously oriented. They had religious estate and dignity, but as persons they were not living it. They were rather engaged in a vengeance campaign against other people, as was indicated by the situation of the present hostages. This situation, politically, may be justified on several counts, but in terms of religion, it cannot be justified. It cannot be justified with the concept that two wrongs make a right. Nor can it be justified by the Sermon on the Mount, in which the individual is reminded that to forgive, to pardon, to have mercy, these are great religious virtues. Now we also find in this particular situation the failure of Muslim leadership as a religion. It is not in a position to actually adjust its own doctrines to protect, lead, direct, enlighten, and clarify the situation of its policies. This situation is what has threatened the world on a number of occasions, and will continue to do so until religion itself clarifies its own position and accepts a dedication above all, might say, partisanism on any level. When the disciples began to hope that Jesus was going to finally take back the kingdom of Judea from Rome, the Master said very simply, "My kingdom is not of this world." The kingdom of religion is not of this world. The kingdom of religion is a kingdom of spiritual value. It is not a plaything of policy. It is not something that is to be adapted to the conveniences of selfishness or personal ambitions. The important thing for the last 100 years especially is that religion must restore its essential purpose and dignity. It must begin by doing that which it would demand secular institutions to accomplish, namely, achieve its own internal unity. There is very little difference between political parties and religious denominations. They are in conflict, they are in competition, they are seeking to dominate their various spheres of influence, and they have no actually common ground. There is a theoretical common ground. We know that the 10 Commandments exist in practically every religion of the world. We know that to do unto others as we would have others do unto us has been translated into the religious codes of over 50 different beliefs. These common grounds, however, are not practiced. In actual relationships with the problems of living, the identities of religion are compromised. We are still in need of a religious cooperative, a league of nations in religion rather than a league of notions. To achieve this, religion must put its own house in order. It is not important or necessary that different religions should give up their beliefs and meet in some sectarian group or a group made up of sectarianisms. Its primary purpose is to restate itself on the essential reason for the existence of religion in the life of man. All religions should be on good terms with each other. They should respect and accept differences of theology as they accept differences of race or differences of color or difficulties of language. But there is no reason why religion should not be a unity, a common strength, indivisible, and have as its primary purpose the advancement of all constructive and useful knowledge, physical, moral, ethical, spiritual. This is the first task. This is the challenge. Until religion is able to put its own house in order, it is going to have great difficulty in attempting to govern or direct secular activities. Until religion itself is recognized for what it is, the will of God revealed through natural law to all mankind. This recognition then begins to make a change in the structure of our theology. Today, most religious leaders I assume to be sincere. I believe they are doing what they believe to be right for the good of man and the glory of God. But these different leaders have lacked the background experience which was part of the education of the temple mysteries of antiquity. The average religious leader is not a statesman. He is a theologian. He is not a scientist. In fact, he is often in conflict with science. He is not a highly trained philosopher who has found the depths within himself as the basis of an over-realization of responsibilities. He is actually a person tied into the structure of a belief and believes that the highest moral duty is to sustain that belief, to protect it, to serve it. Now, the beliefs themselves are not necessarily wrong. There are many of them very beautiful and very noble. And that religion is making a contribution to common good cannot be and should not be denied. It is doing a considerable amount of work. But this considerable amount of work is largely compromised by ineptitudes. The individual who is an evangelist today is not comparable to the initiate priest of antiquity. He is not a person who is able to see and appreciate truth outside of his own denomination. He is not able to work for a strong reconciliation between beliefs. His idea of reconciliation is that all others should join his belief. This situation is not very helpful in terms of modern policy. We have on the one hand, therefore, a well-intentioned theology that wants to be helpful, but to do its full job must be completely reconstructed so that educationally everyone who comes out of a seminary is a deep, broad, wise, and practical thinker. Not only acquainted with the principles of his sect, but fully acquainted with the needs of mankind, and with this equipped skills to serve those needs intelligently. It is not a devotion alone that is going to solve our problem. It must be solved by an intelligent devotion, a devotion which transcends most of the limitations which have separated creeds for thousands of years. After coming to a practical and proper conclusion, having the skills of the statesman and the ideals of the priest, and these are brought together in lives dedicated to common service, we would have a far better chance of meeting all of our problems, both those which are spiritual and those which are secular. Now, as the religious world is so divided, so is the secular. And at the present time, the United Nations organization reveals the conflicts that arise in the administrations of government. Now, why do these conflicts exist? They exist because the average leader in the secular field is not a philosopher. He is not a deep thinker. He is an individual who has had very specialized training, perhaps in business, perhaps in law, or whatever his background may be. But he is not a person who is able to instinctively and inevitably make a discovery that was given to the world thousands of years ago, namely that all human affairs are governed by divine law. Every lawmaker must, to fulfill his purposes, understand the grand plan of life, which he hopes to serve, which he would like to advance. He must therefore be a person in whose nature are solutions. Solutions based upon a comprehensive understanding of the condition of the human being. It would be very important for him to be a universally educated individual. And if this is lacking, then whatever specialization he may have given his career to in order to advance his own purposes, this specialization should be under a direct concept of integrities. In other words, the university, which is the modern equivalent, so to say, of the ancient mysteries, but is not a very good equivalent. The universities should also include to all students the grand scheme of life, the essential reasons and purposes. Now, some will say that this cannot be done because these overtones cannot be scientifically diagnosed. That the individual, in order to accept a high integrity, must assume qualities which he does not understand and which may exist only in the minds of those around him. This is essentially not true. There's no area in human education in which the facts of life are not obvious and cannot be demonstrated scientifically. Therefore, the science of integrity is the most important of all sciences and should be at the head of all the curricula that we have today. The whole survival of man, the whole survival of institutions, the security of the individual, the happiness and peace he longs for, all of these are byproducts of integrity. And without that basic value, the world can never escape from its dilemmas. Integrity, therefore, becomes an essential. Now, the average person is not trained in integrities. And under the prevailing system that we have today, integrity is virtually a debility. Integrity is an almost certain source for failure. The individual trying to live according to principles finds that these principles are detrimental in a system in which the integrity is lacking. He might also notice, of course, that this lack of integrity is bringing disaster to all these institutions. But he still does not feel strong enough, wise enough, or perhaps gifted enough to attempt a universal reformation. This was the principle behind the Reformation which took place in the early 17th century, with a reorganization of the whole theory of human relationships. This reorganization was based upon one simple point, namely that science, properly understood, properly directed by enlightened minds, is the most powerful aid to religion that exists. It is science that can prove religion. It is science that can take religion out of the clouds and put it to work in the daily life of the individual. Science must, however, first discover the sacredness of its own knowledge. It must recognize that the further it explores into the unknown, the closer it comes to God. And that instead of God being a useful hypothesis, God becomes the ever-present source of every particular that exists in space. Science, so equipped, could be very, very useful, in fact indispensable, to the protection of society in the centuries that lie ahead. But it can only be so when it is restored as it was in antiquity, as part of a universal program of education, which went all the way from biology to music, and went all over that vast distance between psychology and mysticism. These different aspects of one great reality have not been brought together. And until they are brought together and harmonized, this mysterious elixir of life that we hope for cannot be produced. Now, on the opposite side of our problem, we have trained statesmen and untrained statesmen. The degree of their training is more or less secondary. The main problem always is, what is the person himself? Is he, by nature, upright? Is he doing the very best he knows? And does he know enough to do something that is best? If he has the knowledge, has he the character to defend his principles against the inconsistency of his associates? This is a problem that we also face, but we are a little bit in the condition of the blind leading the blind, and everything is falling into the ditch together. To meet this type of problem, many very thoughtful persons feel deeply involved, and many individuals who will never have a word to say in the government of things have ideas that would be intensely useful if they could be brought to the attention of the right persons. The right persons, however, today are locked within patterns. They're held within allegiances. And just as the theologian is bound to the rules of his church, so the politician is bound to the rules of his party. They are both in the same difficulty. And until one or other solves the difficulty, progress cannot be guaranteed. Up to that time, we must do the best we can. On the grounds of the remark or words of Jesus, that his kingdom is not of this world, then where is this kingdom? Where are we going to find it? If it is not in society, if it is not in operation anywhere in the current world of events, where shall we look for it? The kingdom of Jesus, the heavenly world, is a spiritual phenomenon. This is part of the spirit of man. It is part of the soul of man. And the great throne of spiritual integrities is within man himself. It is no longer possible to deny the individual the right to grow. But it is not inevitable that this right will be challenged. And even if it is challenged, it is not certain that the individual will accept the challenge. Because of the inconveniences of integrity, many persons are allowing their own lives to run contrary to a constructive destiny. Actually, we have in the world today somewhat over 3 billion human beings who are essentially committed to religion. The religions are different. but they are all always the same in one circumstance, that they are the guides to the inner life of persons. They are the rock which we depend upon in emergencies. When worldly conditions fail, the individual has no source of strength but his own inner life. And this inner life supports him by revealing to him the integrities by which survival is possible. So we have a kind of institution composed of 2/3 of the population of the earth. And this institution has always had the same essential teaching. It has always emphasized personal value. It has emphasized morality and ethics. It has taught us most of the useful rules of life, which we have continuously discounted or ignored. These rules tell us that the only end to conflict is the realization of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Now, the fatherhood of God does not seem to give us too much trouble, but the brotherhood of man is really in frightful condition. It has been broken up until our brothers are only those who agree with us. Our brothers are those who contribute to our personal success in one way or another. Our brothers are those whom we can depend upon when our needs are great. But we are not at all sure that our brother is not going to charge us 18% interest when we need something from him. Consequently, while we live in a world which is filled with churches, mosques, synagogues, pagodas, dagobas, we are living in a secular world. A world in which spiritual values no longer lead the collective conduct of society. Under such emergencies, we all realize that we are also temporary citizens of this earth. This small globe we call the world is really merely a guest house along the great caravansary of cosmic motion. We are here for a time. We are citizens of the nations to which we belong for a few years, perhaps to be stretched to a century by scientific skills, but we are always citizens of eternity. The divine world which reaches out beyond the furthest star, the divine laws which govern the motions of galaxies, these are the fundamentals. And when we leave this mortal sphere, we are again part of the vast project of existence. We are to go on to unfold those values which are indispensable to universal citizenship. It would be very convenient, helpful, and inspiring if this universal citizenship could at least in its beginning bind the parts of our earth together. If we are citizens of the universe, we are also citizens of the smaller world, which is our temporary habitation. And it is very much in order to begin the simple but direct process of binding up the wounds which are the cause of the present tragedies. We have been short-sighted, self-centered, and overly ambitious. And not one of these is a spiritual grace. We have overlooked entirely the fundamental realities of life. Yet we see these realities around us every day. We live not in a man-made world, but in a universal pattern. And we have tried to obscure that pattern by our own audacity. We have tried to assume that we were lords of all we survey, and that it was our destiny to create a system to our own pleasure. We are already finding it very unpleasing. we must sometime go back to facts, because facts alone are our salvation. Now, whether we should be involved in party politics at this particular time will probably be viewed differently by different persons. If we were sure of certain values and knew how to apply these values, if we knew whom we could trust, who would do the things that are necessary, we could advance with greater confidence. Our only source of information available through the media of our time is the record of the candidates themselves. What they have done, what they have stood for, what they have opposed, what they have defended. These are the basis upon which the average person must make his judgment. Now, at this time, there are a great many disillusioned persons, and it was noted in the press not long ago that there might be a very large number of American citizens who would not vote at all, because they did not have confidence in any of the candidates. This is too bad. But it is also a point which must be given a lot of consideration by those who want to make a decision of some kind between the available possibilities. Each must use his own integrities, his own ideals, and his own principles in order to accomplish this particular end. Confucius, in his study of society, made a very interesting ladder leading upward through the stratas of social structure. The foot of this ladder was founded upon the foundation of the home, the most immediate and valuable unit in society. The little democracy or autocracy, according to how it is managed, is the home, which is gradually becoming more or less a ground of activism. The home is the first problem that the individual must solve. According to Confucius, when the home is a proven success, it may be assumed that the members of it have intelligence enough to go higher in their thinking. If the home can be protected, if it can be preserved against the pressures of a decadent system, we have a unit, the first world that we can rule, the first institution, the primary unit of society. This is the fabric upon which all the rest is built. This is the atom which combines to complete the social structure. So if we have principles, if we have integrities, if we have ideals, dreams, and visions, the home is the laboratory for their application. Here we have a right to see, to observe, to study, to reflect, and to discover those principles and convictions which are most likely to preserve not only the outer form of the home, but its inner structure, which is the home itself. So here we have the beginning of a kingdom that is not of this world. Here, spiritual value can come into its own. But it can only do so if those making up the home have the vision necessary to maintain and unfold the potentials of the family life. It would seem, therefore, that as most people are planning or have planned at some time to establish a home, that the principle of home establishment should be a primary factor in education. Now we have home economics, in which we teach people to cook and sew and mend and repair and restore their appliances. We have various counselings on what might make the home a little better. We have various points of view as to how the family can be strengthened or a weak family can be restored. But nowhere in this training up to the present time, do we have the realization that education for the home requires a knowledge of practically every art and science of mankind? It cannot be solved on the simple grounds of how to pay for the house. It cannot be solved on the problems of trying to prevent children from being delinquents. The foundation is much deeper. And the foundation of the home is honesty. It is integrity. It is self-sacrifice. It is dedication. It is investment in the future at the expense of the pleasures of the moment. Until these principles are assured, the home will not survive adequately. And until an expansion of these principles is applied to society in general, the affairs of nations will languish. Above the home, according to Confucius, the next unit to be considered is the community. Now in China in his days, communities were not very large. The living built little villages among the mounds of the dead. And the graveyards were also used to cultivate rice. In those days, the family situation was comparatively simple in its relationship to the community. The community had made a very definite discovery, namely that it had to work together or not survive. It came to the belief that a community has to be held together by a moral binder. And this binder was common integrities, common willingness to sacrifice, mutual helpfulness, and the defense of the community against the aggressions of outsiders. This was also the burden of tribal life among the American Indians. The tribe was the next unit above the family. And the problem of the tribe was solved in only one way. The members had to work together. Out of this, Buddha brought his concept of world communalism, in which the world was recognized as one great community, a community which could not be divided without tragedy, a community in which the rights of each person were protected by all other members of the community. We are beginning to develop a new communalism in this country. Small towns are taking on the problems of their own survival. More and more, the individual is recognizing his contribution to the betterment of the environment in which he lives. He is beginning to protect his environment, protect his natural resources, conserve his energies, and work together with other equally concerned persons in the preservation of his securities. Above this, Confucius then listed the state as being the aggregate of the communities. They were all cells in the body of the state. The state was a unit also, and as long as the state was a unit, it worked with the parts of itself successfully. But when the state became a super body over the affairs of the community, there was trouble. The same difficulty arose in theology, because if the divine power, the source of life, was an autocrat, and the individual was hopelessly under bondage to principles or processes that he did not understand, there was a danger of revolution. But if the deity itself was embodied in its creation, if it was the substance of all the parts of itself, then it was one being, one indivisible unity, and the parts of it were indispensable elements in this body. And cooperation of parts was the highest virtue that the human society could establish. So today we have to beware that neither theology nor politics becomes a superpower apart from the people. we must beware that the unity is made up of the people and not imposed upon the people. That this unity is an experience of the citizen and not a legistic situation in which he is forced into line by penalty or promise. Actually, then, the whole structure, moving upward from the lowest to the highest, is based upon the recognition that one life flows through all things, and that any misuse of that life is to the detriment of all things, not merely to the detriment of the individual himself. Selfishness is a sin against life and truth. Yet it is very common, it is largely approved, it is considered to be almost indispensable. If then we are to equate the place of the person in the political structure, we have to point out that he has primarily a duty to truth. So far as it is possible for him to know what is right, he must do what he knows. To whatever degree he is considering himself as in competition with other selves, his society will fail. It is by mutual cooperation that we can extend the life of our natural resources, that we can expand our privileges and policies, and also protect the dignity of our personal lives. Unless this is fully realized, we are never going to find a solution. The solution of our problems will never be discovered in a smoke room council hall. It will be discovered, these principles will be discovered in space. They will be discovered in the universe itself. They will be man's recognition of the plan, not only for his good, but the plan by which he was created, and by which he must be protected and preserved if he is to survive. In doubt and in lack of certainty and not knowing what direction to turn, the individual must realize that his own information is inadequate. He has been very busy building a career. He has learned all that he could about something in order to make a living. In this he shares in common the problem of the theologian and the politician. He is a specialist, and his specializations have largely come to be dominated by materialistic situations. His specialization in the advancement of science or the advancement of the arts, all this specialization leaves him on the horns of a dilemma when he attempts to interpret political problems. He is simply not equipped. And he must depend upon the same opinionism in this field with which he is afflicted in his own private affairs. He is working from an opinion and not from a fact. He is working from hearsay, from the pressure of publicity, from propaganda, from the opinions of the media. He is not working from a ground of solid principles within himself. Now, it may be impossible for the average person to attempt a re-education of his entire background. He cannot be assumed in middle life to begin a complete understanding, estimation, or research into the social problems. Even if he attempted this, he could select only one or two of them. And he might become proficient in one area of ignorance, but many other areas would be unconditioned. This being inevitably the truth, nature itself has given us the answer. And it is written in the Declaration of Independence. And that is our peculiar relationship to nature and nature's God. That most of all, our directives come from one unified source. And that unified source is natural law. We do not have to study all of the different problems in detail. We know that certain basic laws operate, and that one of the most important of these laws is cause and effect. What we cause will come to us. What we do will inevitably have reactions. And the only safety we have is to do that, the reaction of which is beneficial. Now, this does not take a vast amount of training, but simply a little quiet observation. If we look around us, we will find that the law of cause and effect always operates. It operates in the universe, it operates in human affairs, it operates in individual living. This law tells us simply that if we want to have security, we must cause it. We must create it by our own conduct. When many people may say that we don't live long enough to make all of the adjustments that are necessary, that may well be true. But fortunately, nature has provided this emergency with a proper solution. If we do not live long enough to attain what we know to be necessary, we will be given additional time to accomplish this. We will live in this environment or under the conditions of this environment for whatever time is necessary for us to learn the truth. And the correlative law of rebirth steps in at this point, assuring us that if we start to grow, we will gain that which is necessary. And our growth will be protected until we attain the full fruition of our labor. But we have to start sometime. And we have to start perhaps with a very simple concept. And that is this concept of universal justice as universal benevolence. The very problems that we face and which we resent are given to us by a power dominated by love and compassion. We are like ill-guided children who have become unmanageable. And management now is not invested in the state. Management is invested in ourselves. The individual who cannot change the political destiny of a nation must find some consolation in changing the social destiny of himself. To do this, he only needs to accept a few basic principles and then use the faculties of observation and reflection with which he has been endowed. There is no need for him to make a vast project. The need is merely to observe, to reflect upon things seen and heard, and to watch the consequences of conduct. The theologian is in the better position in this because he already has a solid belief in divine providence. The politician is less equipped because he is, as a group, not so aware of his dependency. The average politician seems to feel himself to be strangely in authority. Well, he is, actually. But for the good of all, his authority must be founded in turn in the divine plan and purpose. Now, in the next few months, there's going to be quite a bit of social confusion. And we are going to be besieged on every hand with mysterious recommendations. We are going to be in doubt about nearly everything. And we will not be very certain as to what course is best for us to pursue. First of all, as the metaphysicians of the 1920s used to say, don't take on conditions. Do not allow yourself to have your personal life completely disrupted. Do not wander about with griefs and grudges and grievances. whatever is, the master of the show is there. The political situation is involved also in the great drama of things. Wherever policy fails from truth, policy is in trouble. And though policy may stubbornly maintain its own way for a time, it falls from the weakness within itself. The individual cannot prevent all kinds of political emergencies. But all these emergencies, like domestic problems, are more or less necessary to the growth of the individual. They are things he must face. We have for some years been under a highly protective society. We have allowed other people to do most of our thinking for us, and also paying handsomely for this privilege. Actually, the great future of things, the destinies of nations, cannot be controlled by the average person. The only thing the average person can do is to learn from what happens. This world is a kind of theater, and we go to see the various performances that are played for our amusement or our instruction. We will therefore find it desirable and necessary to continue to enrich our own inner lives. We cannot afford to wander about predicting only ill. We cannot be on the verge of despair all the time. We cannot be completely frustrated if our candidate does not win. We are developing a kind of tempest in our private teapot. Each individual becomes hopelessly involved in a situation he cannot control. This is a mistake. It is for him to think straight and clear, do the best he can, and try to understand the motives within himself. Now, a large part of voting has been, for at least the last 50 or 75 years, related to personal advantage. This personal advantage is not only in terms of political leadership, but is in terms of private allegiances. The individual has a tendency to favor rules that make things more comfortable for him. If they gain him some small immediate gain, he quietly overlooks the ultimate loss. In other words, he votes selfishly. And each thoughtful person in this coming time should try not to give his allegiance to that which makes life more pleasant for him alone at the expense of someone else. He should not try to favor words or thoughts or declarations which he can interpret as relieving himself of responsibilities. Fraternalism in government is not a success. It has already seriously undermined the resourcefulness of the average person. We have become more and more dependent upon the good life. Therefore, we are very apt to vote for that which promises to protect and perpetuate the good life. But a thoughtful person will say, can such a promise be kept? And he may decide that it cannot be. If a good life means the continuous impoverishment of natural resources and the continuing corruption of society, it is not a good life. And if it does not collapse in our time, it will fall upon our descendants. Therefore, the first thing that the private citizen can do is to quietly decide in his own mind what promises and what claims actually are the best for all citizens. Not to favor a class, a clique, or a corporation, but what is the best for the world? What is the best for our leadership in international affairs? What is the principle by which the greatest good to the greatest number is going to be attained? When we decide in ourselves, upon our own limited resources, that which we believe to be an unselfish, impersonal consideration, that is probably the direction which our vote should go. Because it means that we have been honest, and regardless of outcome, if we have been misrepresented, regardless of what happens, conscience within ourselves is our defender. We have done what we sincerely, unselfishly believe to be right. Now, everyone has the privilege of doing this. He has the privilege of thinking through in his own way all these different values to discover, if possible, the noblest aspiration of his own nature. He has an opportunity to prove himself to be stronger than his ambitions. He might be able to prove that his character will survive the reduction of his standard of living. He must gradually disentangle himself from the complex of wealth which now dominates so many, on the obvious ground that it is dwindling. And one by one, institutions built upon self-aggrandizement are collapsing, so that it is very wise for the person at this time in society to think frugally, to think conservatively as far as his own needs are concerned, to refrain from riotous spending, and use the pressures of price and scarcity to reform and integrate his own personality. He may find that he cannot afford certain luxuries, or to afford them must create debt. And when he looks at the budget pattern in the United States, he realizes what is meant by a national debt. He realizes that the whole nation is living on the interest of what it owes, not what it has. These things come right down to personal life. And this whole emergency, which may extend for some years, is the great challenge of the individual to achieve a victory of his inner life over the circumstances of his environment. It is a testing ground for value. It is an opportunity for the human being to emerge from this strange delusion of success and fame with which he has been afflicted for some time. So do not consider privation a great sorrow. Rather, indicate that it enables us to be more selective in our values, more wise in our spending, more honorable in our investing. We also realize that wherever we contribute to inflation, we are contributing to the collapse of our economy. Therefore, we do the best we can to make do in every way possible, the best we can to protect ourselves and our families from unnecessary extravagances which will contribute to the final collapse of our institutions. So out of this problem, there come two very, very important facts. One is that we can depend upon infinite law in all things. And the second important truth is that we can depend upon human arrangements for very few things. The eternal pattern is there, but the shifting sands of human arrangements and misarrangements offer very little security. We can trust deity, but we cannot trust systems built upon selfishness and self-aggrandizement. So we must have certain reservations about the way things are done now, but we can have a clear vision of the way in which they ought to be done. And more people are waking up gradually to what constitutes the facts of life. It's a little hard, it's a little depressing, They make sacrifice, but it is bringing thousands of families together, whereas success separated them. It is bringing nations gradually into a recognition of common needs, and will, in the course of time, shake down the various power cliques with which we are afflicted. So in this time from now to the end of the year, we're going to have all kinds of excitement. The individual should calmly and quietly watch, listen, and think. Learn to use the faculties with which he has been endowed, not to gratify his appetites, but to direct his conduct. Learning to do those things which make him less guilty of cooperating with fallacies. It is very important that each person will recognize that the needs of the moment require a high degree of personal self-discipline. In this emergency also, religion re-emerges. Religion begins to affirm itself. All over the world, religion is increasing. Religious peoples are becoming more and more aware that it is only in the eternal principles that security can be hoped for. Now, as religion increases, a very great decision must arise in religion also. It must remember the words of its teacher, "My kingdom is not of this world." Religion must not take the opportunity offered by human insecurity to exploit the human family. It must not attempt to gain economic profit from the misery of people. It should be there with high principles. It should be there with dedication. It should remember its service and not its status. Religion, given this great opportunity, must not abuse it. For if it abuses it, it will be no different from politicians. If politics abuse us on the one side and religion on the other, we are in a bad way. But perhaps not as bad a way as we might think. Because with the failure of the institutionalized structure of theology, all the collapses of the institutionalized structure of policies, the individual stands with his own values as his ever-present help in time of trouble. All of these things will come home to the individual. When man thinks, both the church and the state will be honest. Until man thinks, this greatly desired condition cannot come to us. So we are looking, hopefully, that man's spiritual hunger at this time will bring religions together and help them to recognize their proper spheres of service. That in time of trouble, inspiration arising from spiritual conviction will protect the individual against the disillusionments of his time. Without religion of some kind, it is almost impossible to prevent psychoses from coming into life. Psychological debilities are due to the weaknesses of our inner spiritual convictions. Therefore, we must strengthen them. We must also support adequately the various institutions we trust. But we must demand of them the integrities which we are beginning to experience within ourselves. The day may yet come when the individual will be more virtuous than his theology. This might be a very desirable thing, because it immediately will result in an elevation of the entire field of religious thought. Man seeking religion must also be aware that the thing that he is gaining is not intended to be the source of worldly gain. He is not to use religion to advance his materialistic attitudes. He is not to use religion as a means of accumulating wealth or influencing and over-influencing those around him. He is not to use religion as a source of profit, and he is not to allow religion to promise him this. He is duty-bound to realize that the purpose of religion is to strengthen character and not to increase worldly goods. This is becoming also a problem, and we are now hearing considerable about it. But the fact remains that the sphere of religion is a sphere of spiritual opportunity. And at this time, after being in the doldrums for some decades at least, religious life is strengthening. And in this religious strengthening of things, faith must not fall into mercenary ways. They must not continue to attempt to support policies which are not ethical or correct. The purpose of religion is to strengthen the spirit of man, to give him the power of being victorious over his own self-interest and his own ambitions. If the religions fall into self-interest and ambition themselves, they frustrate their own purpose. And the level of policy, the purpose of government, is to make possible the protection of the rights of the individual. The individual is entitled to expect from government a reasonable program, a proper economy, a practical solution, and also that government will stand firm with principles whenever corruption arises. If we demand this standard, we will have it. But if we join those who have special interests, we will not have it. If we can cooperate with religion in the improvement of our personal lives, we can always recognize the probabilities that leadership will obey. The strange thing about modern leadership is that basically and fundamentally it wants to be popular. And it is being popular now largely by promising what it cannot fulfill. If policy becomes popular because it expresses the spiritual and moral integrities of individuals, it will operate on that level. The same is true in our media, with which we are having trouble. When the public supports by its own voice, the voice of the people, supports proper entertainment, we'll have it. When the public mind demands proper government, we will have it. And when the human heart expresses its religious convictions in the simple statement of basic truth, we will have that kind of religion. Actually, this great planet that we have is really a cradle for 4.5 billion human beings. They outnumber any party. They dominate any situation. They are the final voice, regardless of what policy afflicts them. And when quietly this voice is heard, speaking for integrity and truth, there will be a general reform in every level of our living. And nature is working in that direction relentlessly. It will never give up. No matter what we do to nature, nature will ultimately win. And in this process, nature is working through, for instance, the increase of population. More and more. It is becoming impossible to compete and survive, because nature doesn't want us to compete and survive. It wants us to cooperate and survive. And nature will have a way if it takes 10 million years. Nature also wants us to conserve all our natural resources. It wants us to use wisely the garden that has been given to us. Nature ultimately will remove most of the boundaries and fences that separate, and will bring us into the realization that we are one family on one little ball floating in space, and that nature has given us everything that is necessary to be a completely self-secure, self-sufficient, and well-adjusted, happy people. It is up to us to follow the lead of nature, observe it, study it, think about it, and dedicate ourselves to the fulfillment of its requirements. Actually, religion, philosophy, science, policy, industry, all of these are merely aspects of our own consciousness. They exist in us, or they would never come out in the world. They are the ways we think or feel, or they could never become embodied in institutions. So it is up to us to put this smaller world in order, to use all the abilities that we have to advance that very necessary condition in which we will live together in harmony and peace, and that again, heaven will lead, as Confucius says. Heaven will lead, and the earth will follow. We are in a condition where this is becoming increasingly apparent to it. Heaven can lead. It is the only leadership that is final. And all earthly leadership is merely a sovereignty tolerated by nature. And if that sovereignty disobeys nature or frustrates its purpose, nature will correct it. And if all other correctives fail, will remove it. All this thinking may be something that we should all give a little thought to. Be quiet, be peaceful, be as wise as you can. Begin to live every day of your life in a spirit of cooperative insights and understanding. And in your own life, and in judging the life of nations, or of religions, or of policies, let us remember the Chinese words, heaven leads and man follows. If we obey this, we will not have too many problems. Thank you very much.